Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Answers channel. Tonight, we are drifting into one of the most captivating and enduring mysteries that has occupied human thought since the beginning of consciousness itself. We are exploring the nature of beauty, that strange and powerful quality that stops us in our tracks when we encounter a stunning sunset, moves us to tears when we hear a piece of music, or leaves us breathless before a painting. Beauty is everywhere and nowhere, obvious yet indefinable, universal yet deeply personal. It is the subject of aesthetics, that branch of philosophy concerned with understanding what makes something beautiful, how we experience aesthetic pleasure, and why beauty matters at all. Before we begin this gentle exploration, if you find yourself drawn to these quiet journeys through ideas that have shaped human understanding, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps other curious minds discover this peaceful corner of contemplation, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your body soften into comfort. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen. Let the questions we explore tonight wash over you like gentle waves, carrying you toward understanding and, eventually, toward rest. Beauty is a concept that seems so immediately recognizable, so intuitively understood, that we might wonder why philosophers have spent thousands of years arguing about it. Yet, when we try to pin down exactly what beauty is, when we attempt to explain why one thing strikes us as beautiful while another leaves us cold, we find ourselves entering territory far more complex and mysterious than we first imagined. Is beauty a property that exists in objects themselves, waiting to be discovered like the weight of a stone or the temperature of water? Or is it something that exists only in the mind of the observer, a subjective response that varies from person to person like preferences for chocolate or vanilla? When we call something beautiful, are we making a statement about the world, or are we simply expressing our own feelings? These questions have occupied some of the greatest minds in human history. They matter because beauty is not some trivial concern, some superficial decoration on the surface of life. Beauty has been placed alongside truth and goodness as one of the highest values humans can pursue. It has been seen as a pathway to understanding ultimate reality, a force that can transform consciousness, and a universal language that speaks across cultures and centuries. The appreciation of beauty, the creation of beautiful things, and the contemplation of aesthetic experience are activities that seem to define what it means to be human. No culture has ever existed without art, without music, without attempts to create objects that serve no practical purpose other than to please the senses and uplift the spirit. As you rest tonight, allow yourself to wonder about the beautiful things you have encountered in your own life. Perhaps there was a moment when you stood before an ocean as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors that seemed impossible, and you felt something shift inside you. Perhaps you remember the first time you heard a particular song, when the melody seemed to reach directly into your chest and rearrange something fundamental there. Perhaps you recall standing in a museum, staring at brush strokes on canvas, and feeling as though the artist was speaking to you across time, sharing a vision that made the world suddenly appear different, richer, more meaningful than it had been moments before. What was happening in those moments? What is this strange alchemy that allows colored pigments arranged in certain patterns to move us, or organized vibrations in the air to transport us to states of consciousness we cannot easily describe? Tonight, we will trace the history of attempts to answer these questions, from ancient Greece to the modern world, from philosophers who believed beauty was an eternal truth written into the fabric of reality, to those who argued it was nothing more than a pleasant illusion conjured by our brains. We will explore how different cultures have understood beauty, how science has attempted to explain our aesthetic responses, and how the very concept of beauty has evolved over time. The journey will take us through grand theories and subtle arguments, through moments of clarity and regions of profound uncertainty. But throughout, we will maintain our gentle pace, allowing ideas to unfold naturally, giving each concept time to breathe and settle. There is no rush. The questions we explore tonight have waited for thousands of years, and they will wait a little longer while we examine them with the careful attention they deserve. So let yourself drift along with these thoughts, following wherever they lead, knowing that understanding beauty is itself a kind of beauty, a recognition of the profound mystery at the heart of human experience. The ancient foundations, when philosophy met beauty. Our story begins over 2,000 years ago, in ancient Greece, where philosophy itself was taking shape as a discipline. In this world of marble temples and olive groves, where thinkers gathered in public spaces to debate the nature of reality, beauty was not considered a separate or specialized topic. It was intimately connected to questions about truth, goodness, knowledge, and the fundamental structure of existence. To understand how the Greeks thought about beauty, we need to enter a worldview quite different from our own, one where the physical world we see around us was understood as a kind of shadow or imperfect copy of a higher realm of perfect forms. Plato, one of the most influential philosophers who has ever lived, developed a theory of beauty that would echo through Western thought for over 2 millennia. For Plato, beauty was not primarily a quality of physical objects at all. Instead, he believed that true beauty existed in what he called the realm of forms or ideas, a non-physical dimension of reality where perfect, eternal, unchanging essences resided. According to this view, when we encounter a beautiful flower, or a beautiful face, or a beautiful piece of music, we are not truly encountering beauty itself. We are encountering a pale reflection, an imperfect copy of the form of beauty, which exists in that higher realm beyond the reach of our senses. Imagine, if you will, that there exists somewhere beyond space and time a perfect template of beauty, an absolute standard against which all beautiful things in our world are measured. This form of beauty is not itself a beautiful thing in the way a sunset or a painting is beautiful. It is beauty itself, the very essence and definition of what beauty is, eternal and unchanging. Every beautiful object in our physical world participates in this form to a greater or lesser degree. And when we recognize something as beautiful, what we are really doing, according to Plato, is remembering or recognizing this eternal form through its imperfect manifestation before us. This might sound abstract and distant, but Plato believed this theory had profound implications. If beauty is an objective form that exists independently of human opinion or perception, then statements about beauty are not merely expressions of personal taste. They are statements about reality that can be true or false. When someone says a sculpture is beautiful, they are making a claim about how well that sculpture reflects the eternal form of beauty, not simply reporting their own feelings. This means that disagreements about beauty are not just matters of opinion, but genuine disputes about objective features of reality. It also means that coming to understand beauty more deeply, developing our capacity to recognize it and create it, is a form of knowledge, a way of accessing truth about the ultimate nature of existence. In Plato's famous dialogue called the Symposium, he presents a vision of beauty as a ladder or staircase that the soul can climb toward higher understanding. We begin by appreciating the beauty of physical bodies. Then we come to recognize that beauty of soul is more valuable than beauty of body. From there, we ascend to appreciate the beauty of laws and institutions, then the beauty of knowledge and wisdom, until finally we reach a mystical vision of beauty itself, pure and unalloyed, the source from which all particular beautiful things derive their appeal. In this view, aesthetic experience is not merely pleasant sensation, but a pathway toward philosophical and even spiritual enlightenment, a way of training the soul to turn away from the constantly changing world of physical objects toward the eternal realm of unchanging truth. Plato's student Aristotle took a somewhat different approach, one more grounded in the observable world around us. While he retained some elements of his teacher's thinking, Aristotle was more interested in analyzing the actual properties that beautiful things seem to share. In his view, beauty was not primarily about participation in a transcendent form, but about the harmonious arrangement of parts into a unified whole. Beauty, for Aristotle, had to do with order, proportion, symmetry, and definiteness of size. A beautiful object is one where the various elements are arranged in proper relationship to one another, where nothing is excessive or deficient, where the whole achieves a kind of perfect balance. This classical conception of beauty as harmonious proportion became enormously influential. It shaped not only philosophical thinking, but also practical approaches to art, architecture, and design for centuries. The ancient Greeks developed mathematical ratios they believed captured the ideal proportions in the human body, in buildings, in musical intervals. The famous golden ratio, approximately 1 to 1.618, was thought to embody a particularly pleasing proportion that appears throughout nature and can be deliberately incorporated into human creations. When we look at classical Greek temples with their carefully calculated columns and pediments, or at sculptures like the Venus de Milo with their studied proportions, we are seeing this theory of beauty as harmonious arrangement made manifest in stone and marble. Aristotle also had important things to say about how we experience beauty, particularly in his analysis of tragedy in his work called The Poetics. He argued that art, including dramatic performances, could produce what he called catharsis, a purging or purification of emotions. When we watch a tragic play, we experience powerful feelings of pity and fear, but these emotions are experienced in a controlled aesthetic context that somehow cleanses and orders them rather than overwhelming us. This suggests that aesthetic experience involves a particular mode of engagement with feeling, one that is neither pure sensation nor detached intellectual analysis, but something in between, a way of experiencing emotion that is simultaneously intense and distanced, personal yet universal. As Greek philosophy gave way to the medieval period, Christian thinkers grappled with how to understand beauty within a framework that placed God at the center of all value. Figures like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas wrestled with questions about the relationship between divine beauty and earthly beauty, about whether the beauty of creation could teach us something about the nature of its creator. Augustine, in his work On Music, explored the idea that beauty in music arises from numerical proportions that reflect divine order. He argued that when we respond to beauty, we are responding to traces of God's rational design imprinted on creation. Thomas Aquinas, writing centuries later, synthesized Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology in ways that would dominate medieval thought. He proposed that beauty consists of three qualities: integrity or perfection, meaning that something possesses all the parts proper to its nature; proper proportion or harmony; and clarity or brightness, a kind of radiance or splendor. These criteria were meant to apply not only to physical objects, but also to moral and spiritual beauty. A beautiful soul, in this view, would be one that possesses integrity of character, harmony among its various capacities and desires, and a kind of luminous clarity of virtue. What all these ancient and medieval thinkers shared, despite their differences, was a sense that beauty was something objective and real, not merely a pleasant sensation but a genuine feature of reality with metaphysical significance. Beauty pointed toward truth, toward order, toward the divine. To cultivate an appreciation for beauty was to cultivate wisdom and virtue. This understanding of beauty as objective, universal, and connected to ultimate value would dominate Western aesthetics for well over 1,000 years, until new ways of thinking began to emerge in the modern period. The birth of modern aesthetics, taste, and the 18th century. As we move forward in time to the 18th century, we encounter a dramatic shift in how philosophers thought about beauty. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a period of revolutionary thinking about human nature, knowledge, society, and the mind. It was during this era that aesthetics emerged as a distinct branch of philosophy with its own questions, methods, and concerns. The very word aesthetics comes from this period, derived from the Greek word for perception or sensation, and it signals a new focus on the subjective experience of the beholder rather than the objective properties of beautiful objects. One of the key developments was the rise of what came to be called the theory of taste. The concept of taste had been used for centuries to describe discernment and refinement in aesthetic matters, but in the 18th century, it became the centerpiece of a new approach to understanding beauty. Philosophers began to argue that judgments about beauty are not conclusions reached through reasoning or logical argument, but immediate, intuitive responses arising from a particular kind of sensitivity or taste. When you encounter something beautiful, you do not need to analyze its proportions or measure its symmetry. You simply respond, directly and immediately, with pleasure or displeasure, attraction or indifference. This represented a major break with earlier rationalist approaches that had tried to establish rules and principles by which beauty could be identified. The theory of taste held that beauty is not something you reason your way toward, but something you feel. This does not mean that taste is entirely arbitrary, or that one person's taste is as good as another's. Many theorists of taste believed that taste could be educated and refined. that through exposure to excellent examples and careful attention, one could develop greater sensitivity and discernment. But the fundamental act of aesthetic judgment remained a matter of feeling rather than reasoning. David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, wrote influentially about this topic in his essay of the Standard of Taste. Hume began by acknowledging the enormous variety in people's aesthetic judgments. What one person finds beautiful, another may find ugly or merely ordinary. Different cultures, different time periods, different individuals all seem to have wildly divergent tastes. Yet Hume noticed something puzzling. Despite all this variety, there seems to be a substantial degree of agreement, at least among educated and sensitive observers, about which works of art are truly great. Certain authors, certain painters, certain composers are recognized across cultures and centuries as masters of their craft. How can this be if beauty is entirely subjective and taste is merely personal preference? Hume's solution was to propose that while beauty does exist in the mind of the beholder rather than in objects themselves, some beholders are better equipped to make accurate judgments than others. Those with refined taste, developed through experience and free from prejudice, are better judges of the beauty than those with coarse or corrupted taste. A true critic, in Hume's view, is someone with delicate sentiment, meaning they can detect subtle qualities that others miss, strong sense, meaning they have good judgment and understanding, practiced attention, meaning they have carefully observed many examples, comparative skill, meaning they can relate works to one another and to standards, and freedom from prejudice, meaning they approach each work without bias or preconception. This creates something like a standard of taste, not an objective rule written into nature, but a practical consensus among those whose taste has been properly developed. When such qualified judges agree about the merits of a work, we have good reason to trust their judgment, even if it differs from our own initial response. This is why the test of time matters in art. Works that continue to please refined taste across many generations and cultures have proven their worth in a way that passing fashions have not. Yet there is something deeply puzzling about this account. If beauty truly exists only in the mind, if it is a subjective response rather than an objective property, then on what basis can we say that some people's responses are better or more accurate than others? If I prefer simple melodies and you prefer complex ones, if I find one painting beautiful and you find another, what makes your taste more refined than mine? Hume's answer involves appealing to delicacy of taste and comparative skill, but these criteria themselves depend on prior aesthetic judgments about what counts as subtle rather than crude, refined rather than coarse. We seem caught in a circle where we need to already know what is beautiful in order to identify those with good taste, but we identify what is beautiful by consulting those with good taste. Edmund Burke, another important 18th century thinker, approached beauty from a different angle in his influential work, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. Burke was interested in the psychological and physiological basis of aesthetic experience. He argued that beauty produces a particular kind of pleasure associated with love, desire, and tenderness. And he tried to identify the properties that tend to evoke this response: smallness, smoothness, gradual variation, delicacy, and clear but not brilliant colors. These are not abstract mathematical ratios, but perceptual qualities that affect us through our senses in immediate ways. Burke was one of the first philosophers to extensively theorize about the sublime, an aesthetic category distinct from beauty. While beauty produces gentle pleasure and attraction, the sublime produces a mixture of terror and exaltation. We experience the sublime when confronted with vast mountains, roaring oceans, violent storms, or anything that overwhelms our ordinary capacities and reminds us of forces far greater than ourselves. The sublime involves a kind of delightful horror, as Burke called it, because we experience the thrill of danger while remaining safely removed from actual harm. This distinction between the beautiful and the sublime would become enormously important in later aesthetic theory, expanding the range of aesthetic experience beyond the pleasant and harmonious to include the overwhelming and awe-inspiring. These 18th century developments set the stage for what many consider the most important single work in aesthetic philosophy, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment. Kant attempted to synthesize and transcend the debates between rationalist and empiricist approaches to beauty, between objective and subjective accounts, creating a framework that would dominate aesthetic theory for generations to come. His work is complex and subtle, but at its heart is an attempt to explain how judgments of beauty can be both subjective and universal at the same time, how they can be based on feeling rather than reasoning, while still claiming validity beyond the individual who makes them. Kant's revolutionary framework. Beauty as subjective universality. Immanuel Kant stands as perhaps the most influential figure in the history of aesthetics. His Critique of Judgment, published in 1790, offered a systematic theory of aesthetic experience that tried to resolve the tensions between earlier objective and subjective approaches to beauty. Kant's theory is notoriously difficult, filled with technical terminology and abstract arguments. But its core insights have shaped how we think about beauty ever since. As we explore his ideas tonight, let them wash over you gently, absorbing what resonates and allowing the rest to drift past. The goal is not mastery, but appreciation, not analysis, but contemplation. Kant began with a deceptively simple question. What happens when we judge something to be beautiful? What kind of mental activity are we engaged in when we say that a sunset is beautiful, or a melody is beautiful, or a painting is beautiful? His answer was that aesthetic judgments are a unique kind of judgment, different from both ordinary factual judgments and moral judgments, operating according to their own logic and arising from a particular state of our cognitive faculties. When we make an ordinary factual judgment, like saying this apple is red or this stone is heavy, we are applying concepts to our perceptual experience, subsuming what we see or feel under general categories. When we make a moral judgment, like saying this action is right or this person is virtuous, we are applying principles of reason to determine what ought to be done. But when we make an aesthetic judgment, Kant argued, we are not applying concepts or principles at all. Instead, we are responding to the free play between our imagination and our understanding. The two faculties that ordinarily work together to produce ordinary experience. In normal perception, the imagination synthesizes the raw data of sensation while the understanding applies concepts to organize and interpret this data. But in aesthetic experience, these faculties engage with each other in a different way. they play freely, without being constrained by the need to apply specific concepts or reach definite conclusions. The imagination presents various possibilities, and the understanding responds without trying to fix them into determinate categories. This free harmony between imagination and understanding produces a distinctive kind of pleasure, what Kant called the pleasure of the beautiful. This might sound abstract, so let's make it more concrete. Imagine you are looking at a landscape, rolling hills covered in autumn leaves, with a river winding through the valley. If you approach this scene with practical concerns in mind, wondering whether the river is crossable or where you might find shelter, you are using your faculties in an ordinary, concept-driven way. If you approach it with scientific interest, classifying the types of trees or analyzing the geological formations, again, you are applying concepts to organize your experience. But if you simply gaze at the scene and find it beautiful, you are allowing your imagination to play with the various colors, shapes, and patterns without trying to pin them down under concepts, while your understanding appreciates this play without trying to force it into categories. Your faculties are engaged in a free, harmonious activity that produces aesthetic pleasure. Kant used a crucial term to describe this pleasure: disinterested. He did not mean that we feel no interest in the beautiful object, or that we are bored by it. Rather, he meant that aesthetic pleasure is free from practical concerns and personal desires. When I judge something beautiful, I am not thinking about whether it is useful to me, whether I can possess it, whether it satisfies some need or want of mine. I am appreciating it for its own sake, for the sake of the experience itself, without any ulterior motive. This disinterestedness is what distinguishes aesthetic experience from other pleasures like enjoying a good meal or feeling comfortable in warm clothing. Those pleasures are bound up with our desires and needs. Aesthetic pleasure transcends such concerns. Here is where Kant's theory becomes most interesting and most puzzling. He argued that when we judge something beautiful, we naturally expect others to agree with us. If I say this sunset is beautiful, I am not merely reporting my own subjective feeling the way I might say I like chocolate ice cream. I am making a claim that I expect to be universal, that I think everyone should find this sunset beautiful if they are capable of aesthetic experience at all. Yet this claim to universality is not based on any objective property of the sunset that I can point to and prove. It is based entirely on my own subjective feeling of pleasure. Kant called this strange combination subjective universality. The judgment is subjective because it is based on feeling rather than concepts or reasoning. It is universal because it claims validity for everyone, not just for the individual making the judgment. How can these be combined? How can a purely subjective feeling ground a claim to universal agreement? Kant's answer is that all humans share the same basic cognitive faculties, the same structure of imagination and understanding. When these faculties are in free, harmonious play, producing aesthetic pleasure in me, I have reason to believe that the same object would produce the same state in you, assuming you attend to it properly and are capable of disinterested contemplation. This does not mean everyone will in fact agree. People may be distracted or biased or unable to achieve the proper disinterested state. But the judgment of beauty contains an implicit demand that everyone should agree. if they are judging aesthetically rather than according to personal preference or practical concerns. When we disagree about beauty, we are not simply discovering that we have different preferences, like preferring different flavors. We are engaged in a genuine dispute about how one ought to respond to the object in question. Kant also made an important distinction between what he called free beauty and dependent beauty. Free beauty is appreciated entirely for its form, without reference to any concept of what the object is supposed to be or what function it is supposed to serve. The beauty of abstract patterns, of flowers considered apart from their biological function, of music considered purely as organized sound, these are examples of free beauty. Dependent beauty, by contrast, depends on a concept of what the object is. A beautiful horse is beautiful in part because it exemplifies what we think a good horse should be. A beautiful building is beautiful in part because it fulfills its function well. Kant thought that only free beauty could ground pure aesthetic judgments, because dependent beauty involves applying concepts rather than experiencing pure free play of the faculties. Beyond beauty, Kant also developed an influential account of the sublime, building on Burke's earlier work, but giving it deeper philosophical grounding. The sublime, for Kant, occurs when we encounter something so vast, so powerful, so overwhelming, that our imagination cannot fully grasp it. Standing before towering mountains, contemplating the vastness of the starry sky, witnessing a violent storm from safety, we experience a kind of failure of imagination. Our imagination struggles to take in and comprehend what we perceive, and this struggle produces an initially unpleasant feeling of inadequacy. But then something remarkable happens. Our reason steps in and recognizes that even though our imagination cannot grasp the infinite or the overwhelming, reason itself can conceive of the infinite, can think thoughts that surpass any sensory representation. In this moment, we experience a feeling of exaltation, a sense of our own dignity and capacity as rational beings capable of transcending the limitations of sensory experience. The sublime thus involves a movement from displeasure to a higher pleasure, from recognition of our limitations to recognition of our capacity to transcend those limitations. It is an aesthetic experience that points us beyond the sensory world toward our own rational and moral nature. Kant's framework, with its concepts of disinterested pleasure, subjective universality, free play of cognitive faculties, and the distinction between beauty and the sublime, provided philosophers with powerful tools for thinking about aesthetic experience. His work influenced virtually every subsequent development in aesthetics, even when later thinkers disagreed with his conclusions or tried to move beyond his framework. The questions he posed and the concepts he developed continue to shape debates in aesthetic philosophy today. The Romantic and Idealist vision. Beauty as gateway to the absolute. In the wake of Kant's critical philosophy came a movement that would profoundly reshape not only aesthetics, but all of European culture. Romanticism, emerging in the late 18th century and flourishing through the 19th, represented both a continuation of and a rebellion against Enlightenment thought. The Romantics agreed with Kant that beauty involved a special kind of experience transcending ordinary perception and practical concerns. But they went much further, seeing aesthetic experience as the highest form of human consciousness and art, as a pathway to ultimate truth about reality itself. The German idealist philosophers, figures like Friedrich Schelling and Georg Wilhelm, Friedrich Hegel, developed elaborate systems in which art and beauty played central roles. These thinkers believed that reality itself was fundamentally mental or spiritual in nature, that what we call the physical world is a manifestation of mind or spirit working itself out through time. In such a view, the mind of the artist is not simply creating pleasant objects or expressing personal feelings. The artist is participating in the cosmic process by which spirit comes to know itself, by which the absolute truth of reality becomes manifest in concrete, sensory form. Schelling proposed that art offers a unique form of knowledge, one that unites the subjective and objective, the conscious and unconscious, in ways that neither philosophy nor science can achieve. In a work of art, Schelling argued, we encounter infinity embodied in finite form, the absolute expressed through particular sensory objects. The artist, in a state of creative genius, serves as a channel through which unconscious spiritual forces flow into conscious objective reality. When we experience great art, we are experiencing nothing less than a revelation of the ultimate nature of existence, truth made visible and tangible in ways that pure thought cannot capture. This might sound like mysticism, and in a sense it is, but it reflects a deep conviction that aesthetic experience cannot be reduced to pleasant sensations or the operation of taste. The Romantics felt that in moments of profound aesthetic experience, something transformative occurs, something that breaks through the ordinary boundaries of selfhood and connects us to forces and meanings beyond individual consciousness. Think of those moments when a piece of music seems to dissolve the boundaries between yourself and something larger, when a landscape appears not just as a collection of trees and rocks, but as a living presence speaking a language older than words. When a poem reaches into you and rearranges your understanding of what it means to be human. The Romantics took such experiences with utmost seriousness as genuine encounters with reality at its deepest level. Arthur Schopenhauer, another influential 19th century thinker, developed his own unique vision of aesthetic experience within a pessimistic metaphysical system. Schopenhauer believed that reality is fundamentally will, a blind striving force that drives all existence forward in an endless cycle of desire and suffering. All of life is caught up in this will, constantly wanting, never satisfied, always reaching toward the goals that prove empty once achieved. But aesthetic experience, Schopenhauer argued, offers temporary escape from this servitude to will. When we contemplate something beautiful, we momentarily cease to be individual, willing subjects. We become pure, will-less subjects of knowing, absorbed entirely in perception of the object before us. And in this state, we are no longer driven by desire, no longer suffering from the frustration of unsatisfied wants, no longer caught in the practical concerns of survival and success. We simply contemplate, absorbed in the eternal, timeless forms or ideas that the beautiful object makes manifest. A beautiful sunset, a moving piece of music, a sublime natural vista. These are not just pleasant experiences, but temporary releases from the fundamental suffering of existence. Moments when the tyranny of will is suspended, and we know a peace otherwise impossible in this life. For Schopenhauer, the arts could be ranked according to how directly they express the fundamental nature of reality as will. Architecture, dealing with inorganic matter, stands lowest. Sculpture and painting, representing living forms, stand higher. Poetry, capable of expressing human consciousness itself, ranks higher still. But music stands at the peak, because music does not represent the world at all. Music is a direct expression of will itself, the inner nature of reality made audible. When we listen to music with full absorption, we are not perceiving something about the world, but perceiving the world's essential nature directly, unfiltered by concepts or representations. This is why music moves us so powerfully, why it can express emotions and meanings that words cannot capture. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel approached beauty and art from yet another angle within his vast systematic philosophy. Hegel believed that history is a rational process in which spirit, his term for the absolute ultimate reality, progressively realizes itself, becomes conscious of itself, through the development of human culture and consciousness. Art is one of the stages in this process, a way that spirit expresses and recognizes itself before it reaches the higher stages of religion and philosophy. In Hegel's famous lectures on aesthetics, he traced the development of art through three great phases, each reflecting a different relationship between spiritual content and sensory form. In what he called symbolic art, exemplified by ancient Egyptian pyramids and monuments, spiritual meaning is merely suggested or pointed toward by massive physical forms that cannot fully embody it. In classical art, exemplified by ancient Greek sculpture, there is perfect balance between form and content, between the physical medium and the spiritual meaning it expresses. A Greek statue of a god achieves perfect harmony between the ideal it represents and the marble that gives it shape. But in Romantic art, which for Hegel meant essentially Christian art of the medieval and modern periods, content begins to overflow form. The spiritual meanings that art attempts to express become too deep, too infinite, too inward to be fully captured in sensory objects. A Gothic cathedral, with its soaring arches and light-filled spaces, points beyond itself toward a transcendent reality that cannot be made fully present in stone and glass. Modern art, in Hegel's analysis, reveals the limitations of sensory form to contain spiritual truth, and this ultimately points toward philosophy as a higher mode of expression, one that deals directly in concepts rather than sensory images. This creates an interesting and controversial conclusion. Hegel argued that art, in the modern world, is essentially over, at least in terms of its highest spiritual function. This does not mean people will stop making art, or that art will cease to be produced. It means that art is no longer the primary vehicle through which the deepest truths about reality and human existence are expressed and understood. Philosophy has taken over that role. Art becomes, in a sense, a thing of the past, an object for reflection and analysis, rather than a living, evolving form of spiritual expression at the cutting edge of human consciousness. This thesis about the end of art provoked enormous debate and remains controversial today, but it reflects the seriousness with which Hegel took beauty and art. Like Schelling and Schopenhauer, despite their many differences, Hegel saw aesthetic experience as intimately bound up with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and human consciousness. The Romantics and idealists refused to treat beauty as a merely decorative addition to life, a source of pleasant but trivial enjoyment. For them, beauty mattered absolutely, because through beauty we encounter truth, meaning, and perhaps even salvation from the suffering and limitations of ordinary existence. The Great Divide: Objectivity versus Subjectivity. As we drift deeper into our exploration, we encounter one of the central fault lines running through aesthetic philosophy, a divide that goes back to ancient times but became especially sharp in the modern period. Is beauty objective or subjective? Does it exist in things themselves, independent of anyone perceiving them? Or does it exist only in the minds of beholders? This question may seem abstract, but it has profound implications for how we think about aesthetic disagreements, artistic value, the possibility of aesthetic education, and the very meaning of calling something beautiful. The subjective view of beauty can be summed up in the famous phrase, "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder." This suggests that when we call something beautiful, we are not describing an objective property of that thing, but rather expressing our own subjective response to it. Beauty is not in the sunset itself, but in my mind as I perceive the sunset. Another person might look at the same sunset and feel nothing, and if beauty is subjective, we cannot say that one of us is right and the other wrong. We simply have different responses, and that is all there is to say. This view has obvious appeal. It seems to explain why people disagree so much about beauty, why tastes vary so widely across individuals and cultures, why there seem to be no universally agreed upon standards of beauty that hold for all times and places. It also seems to respect individual autonomy and freedom, refusing to impose one person's or culture's aesthetic values on others. If beauty is subjective, then diversity of taste is natural and legitimate, and attempts to establish objective standards or rules about what counts as beautiful seem misguided, or even oppressive. David Hume, as we discussed earlier, held a version of this subjectivist view when he wrote that beauty is no quality in things themselves, but exists merely in the mind which contemplates them. Yet even Hume, as we saw, felt the need to establish some kind of standard, some way of distinguishing better from worse aesthetic judgments, even within a broadly subjectivist framework. The complete subjectivist position, taken to its logical conclusion, would make all aesthetic disagreements mere expressions of different tastes, no more amenable to reasoned discussion than disagreements about whether coffee tastes better than tea. In the 20th century, this radically subjectivist view was pushed even further by some philosophers influenced by logical positivism and emotivist theories of value. According to this view, aesthetic judgments are not really judgments at all in the ordinary sense. They are not statements about the world that could be true or false. They are merely expressions of emotion, like saying, "hooray," or "yuck." When I say this painting is beautiful, I am not making a claim about the painting. I am simply expressing my positive feelings toward it, somewhat like expressing pleasure through a sigh or a smile. This emotivist theory seemed to some philosophers to solve various puzzles about aesthetic disagreement and the impossibility of proving aesthetic claims. But it came at a high cost. It made aesthetic discourse seem trivial, as though all our passionate discussions about art, all the care artists put into their work, all the education and training that goes into developing aesthetic sensitivity, were based on a fundamental confusion about what we are doing. It suggested that there is no such thing as expertise in aesthetic matters, no sense in which a trained critic's judgment is worth more than an untutored observer's snap reaction, since both are merely expressing feelings that cannot be right or wrong. Many philosophers found this conclusion unacceptable. Surely, they argued, there is a difference between good and bad art, between beauty and ugliness, that goes beyond mere individual preference. Surely, some aesthetic judgments are better supported than others, more sensitive to relevant features of the object, more informed by relevant experience and knowledge. Surely, we can give reasons for our aesthetic judgments, and those reasons can be evaluated as more or less convincing. All of this suggests that aesthetic judgments are not merely expressions of emotion, but genuine judgments making claims about their objects, claims that can be criticized, defended, and debated in rational discourse. This brings us to various objectivist theories, which hold that beauty is a real property of objects, something that exists independently of our perceptions and responses. The challenge for objectivism is to specify what this property is and how we can know it. The classical view we encountered earlier, that beauty consists in harmonious proportions, offers one answer. Beauty is an objective mathematical relationship among the parts of an object. A building with the golden ratio in its proportions is objectively more beautiful than one with awkward, ungainly proportions, regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates this fact. But this raises problems. Are mathematical proportions really sufficient for beauty? Can we reduce the beauty of a face, a sunset, a symphony to measurements and ratios? And if we could, why do these particular proportions produce pleasure rather than indifference? Is there something in the nature of proportion itself that connects it to beauty, or is the connection contingent, based on how our minds happen to be structured? Moreover, why do tastes change over time if beauty is objective? Why do different cultures seem to have such different aesthetic sensibilities if they are all responding to the same objective features? Some contemporary philosophers have tried to develop more sophisticated versions of aesthetic objectivism. They argue that beauty is a response-dependent property, something like color. Color is neither purely objective, existing in objects regardless of perceivers, nor purely subjective, existing only in minds. Rather, colors are properties objects have in virtue of their disposition to produce certain experiences in normal observers under normal conditions. A ripe tomato is red because it reliably causes red experiences in people with normal color vision looking at it in good light. Similarly, something is beautiful if it disposes normal observers under normal conditions to have certain aesthetic experiences. This allows for both objectivity and subjectivity. There are objective facts about which things are beautiful, grounded in the dispositions of objects and the responses they produce. But these facts depend essentially on the existence of observers with particular sensory and cognitive equipment. If humans were radically different, or if intelligent aliens with completely different perceptual systems visited Earth, what counts as beautiful might be very different. Beauty would still be objective in the sense that claims about it could be true or false, but it would be objective relative to a particular kind of observer rather than absolute. This middle ground position has appeal, but it leaves many questions unresolved. What counts as a normal observer? How do we identify normal conditions? And perhaps most pressingly, if beauty depends on human responses, and human responses vary so widely, can we really say there are objective facts about beauty rather than a plurality of beauty for this culture or beauty for this individual? The debate between objectivism and subjectivism continues in contemporary aesthetics, with thoughtful philosophers defending versions of each position and various intermediate views. What becomes clear as we contemplate this debate is that the question of whether beauty is objective or subjective may not admit of a simple yes or no answer. Beauty seems to have aspects of both objectivity and subjectivity woven inextricably together, and perhaps our task is not to choose between these options, but to understand how they relate to each other, how our subjective experiences can be oriented toward objective features of the world while also being shaped by our particular nature as the kinds of beings we are. Beauty across cultures, universal or relative. As you continue to rest, let your mind drift now across vast distances and deep spans of time, considering how different cultures and peoples have understood and experienced beauty. This cross-cultural perspective adds another dimension to our inquiry, one that both enriches and complicates the philosophical questions we have been exploring. If we discover that all cultures share certain aesthetic sensibilities, this might support objectivist theories that beauty is a universal feature of human nature, or even of reality itself. But if we find radical divergence in what different cultures find beautiful, this might support more relativist or subjectivist views. The Western philosophical tradition we have been tracing, from ancient Greece through the Enlightenment to German idealism and beyond, represents only one way of thinking about beauty and aesthetic experience. Other cultures developed their own rich aesthetic traditions, often with very different emphases and concerns. To understand beauty more fully, we need to look beyond the Western canon and consider how other parts of the world have grappled with these questions. In East Asian aesthetics, particularly as developed in China and Japan, we find conceptions of beauty quite different from the classical Western emphasis on harmony, proportion, and perfection. Japanese aesthetic philosophy, deeply influenced by Zen Buddhism, developed concepts that celebrate impermanence, imperfection, and incompleteness. The idea of wabi-sabi, for instance, finds beauty in things that are imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. A tea bowl with an irregular shape, a weathered wooden post, the changing colors of autumn leaves, a garden where mosses grow naturally, without careful manicuring. These exemplify wabi-sabi aesthetics. This is not merely a different style or taste, but a different philosophy of beauty, rooted in Buddhist insights about the nature of existence. In Buddhist thought, all things are impermanent, constantly changing, lacking any permanent essence. Attachment to permanence and perfection causes suffering because it goes against the fundamental nature of reality. Wabi-sabi aesthetics embraces this impermanence and finds beauty not in resisting it, but in accepting and celebrating it. The crack in a ceramic vessel, carefully repaired with gold in the Japanese art of kintsugi, becomes beautiful precisely because it reveals the object's history and transformation over time. The passage of time, which Western aesthetics might see as corruption or decay moving away from ideal perfection, becomes in wabi-sabi aesthetics an essential element of beauty itself. Another important concept in Japanese aesthetics is mono no aware, which might be translated as the pathos of things or sensitivity to the ephemeral. This describes a bittersweet awareness of transience, the recognition that beautiful things are beautiful in part because they do not last. The falling cherry blossoms, which bloom so briefly and scatter so quickly, are more beautiful precisely because of their impermanence. They embody the fleeting nature of all existence, and awareness of this transience deepens our appreciation rather than diminishing it. There is something profound in this, a recognition that beauty and loss are intimately connected, that to truly see beauty is to see it passing away even as we experience it. Chinese aesthetics, influenced by both Taoist and Confucian thought, emphasizes harmony between humans and nature, between different elements of a composition, and between the artist and the cosmic order. In traditional Chinese painting, vast, empty spaces are as important as the brushstrokes depicting mountains or trees. These empty spaces are not merely background, but active elements representing the Tao, the underlying principle or way that flows through all things. A painting is not trying to realistically represent every detail of a landscape, but to capture its essential spirit, its qi, or vital energy. The Chinese concept of Tianren-hei, unity of heaven and humanity, suggests that the highest beauty occurs when human creativity aligns with natural processes, when the artist becomes a channel for forces greater than individual will or intention. This resonates with certain romantic ideas we encountered earlier, but comes from a very different philosophical tradition with different assumptions about the relationship between self and world, mind and nature, art and reality. In examining such cross-cultural differences, we need to ask, are these simply different styles, different ways of creating beauty according to fundamentally similar principles? Or do they reflect genuinely different conceptions of what beauty itself is? When a Japanese tea practitioner finds beauty in the irregularity of a rustic tea bowl and a Western classical aesthete finds beauty in the perfect symmetry of a Greek temple, are they experiencing the same quality through different manifestations? Or are they experiencing fundamentally different qualities that we label with the same word? Recent empirical research in psychology and neuroscience has tried to address these questions by studying aesthetic responses across cultures. Some studies have found significant commonalities. For instance, people from many different cultures tend to prefer certain kinds of landscapes, those with open views, water features, moderate complexity, and suggestions of shelter and resources. This might reflect evolutionary history. Our ancestors who found such landscapes attractive and chose to settle near them may have been more successful, passing on both genes and cultural preferences for certain environmental features. Research has also found some cross-cultural agreement about facial beauty. Certain features, like symmetry and averageness, faces that represent the average of many individual faces combined, tend to be rated as attractive across diverse cultures. This has led some researchers to argue for evolutionary theories of beauty, suggesting that aesthetic preferences are partly hardwired by natural selection because they helped our ancestors identify healthy mates, safe environments, and other fitness-relevant features of the world. However, other research emphasizes the extent of cultural variation in aesthetic judgments. Studies comparing how people from different cultural backgrounds respond to the same artworks have found both commonalities and significant differences. Some attributes, like visual harmony, color variety, and emotional content, seem to influence beauty judgments across cultures. But preferences can diverge significantly, for instance. One study found that German participants tended to find complex artworks more beautiful, while Japanese participants preferred simpler compositions. Cultural context shapes not just what we find beautiful, but how we think about beauty and what role it plays in our lives. In some cultures, aesthetic sensitivity is seen as a mark of moral and spiritual development. In others, it may be viewed more as a leisure activity or source of pleasure separate from ethical concerns. Some cultures have elaborate systems of aesthetic education, passing down techniques and sensibilities through generations of training. Others may emphasize spontaneity and individual expression over mastery of tradition. This cross-cultural perspective complicates simple answers to our questions about the objectivity or universality of beauty. It suggests that human aesthetic capacities may have both universal and culturally variable aspects, that evolution and biology provide certain basic sensitivities and preferences, while culture and individual experience shape how these develop and what specific forms they take. The picture that emerges is complex, refusing to fit neatly into either pure universalism or pure relativism, suggesting instead that beauty exists at the intersection of universal human nature and particular cultural traditions. The psychology and science of beauty. As the night deepens and you drift along with these ideas, let us turn our attention to what empirical science has discovered about beauty and aesthetic experience. In the 20th and 21st centuries, psychology, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology have brought new methods and perspectives to questions that were once purely philosophical. While these scientific approaches cannot replace philosophical inquiry, they can inform it, providing data and theories that philosophers must take into account in developing their views. Evolutionary psychology offers one framework for understanding aesthetic preferences. The basic idea is that our sense of beauty is not arbitrary, but was shaped by natural selection to help our ancestors survive and reproduce. Features we find attractive in other humans, for instance, may signal health, fertility, and genetic quality. A preference for symmetrical faces might exist because asymmetry can indicate developmental problems or disease. A preference for certain body proportions might correlate with reproductive fitness. Clear skin, shiny hair, bright eyes. All the things we associate with human beauty might be indicators that someone is healthy and would make a good mate. Similarly, our preferences for certain natural environments might reflect what was adaptive for our ancestors. Savanna-like landscapes with a mix of trees and open grassland, visible water sources, and vantage points for seeing approaching danger. These are environments where early humans thrived, and evolution may have built-in preferences that made us seek out and enjoy such environments. When we find a beautiful view relaxing or inspiring, we may be responding to ancient signals that this is a good place to be. This evolutionary perspective can explain some of the universality in aesthetic judgments, while also accounting for variation. Basic preferences might be universal because all humans share an evolutionary history, but these can be modified by individual experience and cultural learning. The evolutionary approach also reminds us that aesthetic responses are deeply connected to emotion, motivation, and value. They are not just intellectual judgments, but whole organism responses that orient us toward or away from things in our environment. However, evolutionary accounts face challenges when applied to art and refined aesthetic judgments. Our ancestors did not encounter abstract paintings or complex symphonies. So why do we find these beautiful? Some evolutionary psychologists argue that art hijacks or repurposes cognitive systems that evolved for other functions. For instance, music might engage auditory systems that evolved to detect patterns in nature, while also activating emotional systems in ways that create powerful experiences. Visual art might engage perceptual systems tuned to recognize faces, animals, and landscapes, presenting them in intensified or novel ways that produce pleasure. Neuroscience has begun to investigate what happens in the brain during aesthetic experiences. Using brain imaging techniques, researchers have found that viewing beautiful artwork or hearing beautiful music activates reward systems in the brain, particularly areas rich in dopamine that are associated with pleasure and motivation. These same systems are activated by primary rewards like food and sex, suggesting that aesthetic pleasure taps into fundamental reward mechanisms that drive behavior. Interestingly, the experience of beauty also activates brain areas involved in emotion processing and self-referential thought. When we find something beautiful, we are not just having a simple sensory pleasure, but engaging in complex cognitive and emotional processing that involves relating the object to our own experiences, memories, and sense of meaning. This may explain why aesthetic experiences can be so powerful and transformative, why they can move us to tears or give us chills, why we remember them and seek them out. Recent research has also explored how expertise changes aesthetic responses. Expert art critics, musicians, or other trained observers show different patterns of brain activity when evaluating artworks compared to naive observers. Experts often activate areas involved in detailed analysis and comparison, drawing on stored knowledge about styles, techniques, and artistic traditions. This suggests that developing aesthetic sensitivity involves building up rich knowledge structures that shape how we perceive and evaluate beauty, supporting the idea that taste can be educated and refined, as Hume and others argued. Psychological research has identified individual differences in aesthetic sensitivity that seem to be relatively stable personality traits. Some people are more open to aesthetic experience, more attuned to sensory qualities, more moved by art and beauty than others. This openness to experience is one of the major dimensions of personality identified in psychological research, and it correlates with creativity, imagination, and intellectual curiosity. People high in openness tend to seek out novel and complex aesthetic experiences, to enjoy art that challenges conventional expectations, and to have more intense emotional responses to beauty. There is also research on the psychology of different aesthetic responses beyond beauty. As we discussed earlier, the sublime involves a mix of awe, fear, and exhilaration in response to vast or overwhelming stimuli. Psychologists have studied this experience of awe, finding that it involves a feeling of vastness, perceiving something much larger than oneself, and accommodation, the need to adjust one's mental schemas to incorporate the experience. Awe can be triggered not just by natural grandeur, but also by profound ideas, extraordinary human achievements, or even deeply moving works of art. Studies have found that experiencing awe has interesting psychological effects. It can make people feel smaller and less self-important, but in a positive way, connecting them to something larger than themselves. It can increase prosocial behavior, making people more generous and cooperative. It can shift time perception, making people feel they have more time available. These findings suggest that aesthetic experiences like the sublime are not just pleasant interludes, but can genuinely affect how we see ourselves and our place in the world. Cognitive science has also contributed to understanding aesthetic experience through work on perceptual fluency, the ease with which we process information. Some researchers argue that beauty is partly a function of how easily our perceptual systems can process a stimulus. Symmetrical objects are easier to process than asymmetrical ones. Prototypical faces, those close to average proportions, are easier to process than unusual faces. This fluency creates a positive feeling that we interpret as aesthetic pleasure. However, this cannot be the whole story, since we also find beauty in complex, challenging works that require effort to appreciate. The scientific study of beauty remains in its early stages, and many questions remain unanswered. What exactly is happening in the brain during profound aesthetic experiences? How do cultural factors interact with biological predispositions? Why do some artworks move us so powerfully, while others leave us cold, even when they seem similar in many respects? Science can identify correlations and patterns, but it may not be able to fully explain the meaning and significance that aesthetic experiences have for us, the way they connect to our deepest concerns about value, meaning, and what makes life worth living. Beauty beyond art, natural, mathematical, and moral dimensions. As our exploration continues through the quiet night, let us expand our view to consider beauty in domains beyond art. While aesthetic philosophy has often focused on artistic beauty, humans find beauty in many other contexts. In nature, in abstract mathematical structures, in moral character and actions, even in everyday objects and experiences. Understanding these different forms of beauty can deepen our appreciation for the scope and significance of aesthetic experience in human life. Natural beauty has a special place in aesthetic thought. Long before humans created art, they encountered beauty in sunsets and mountains, in the songs of birds and the patterns of leaves, in the play of light on water and the vast sway of the night sky. This natural beauty raises interesting philosophical questions. If we think of beauty as something created by artists to produce aesthetic responses, how do we make sense of beauty in nature, which was not created with any such purpose? Some philosophers have argued that natural beauty is actually more important than artistic beauty, because it is not mediated by human intention and cultural meanings. When we appreciate a landscape or a flower, we are responding directly to form, color, and pattern without the layers of interpretation required for art. We are not wondering what the artist meant or how the work fits into art historical traditions. We are simply present to the thing itself in its sensory immediacy. Others point out that our experience of natural beauty is never truly innocent or unmediated. We always bring cultural frameworks, learned associations, and aesthetic categories to our encounters with nature. The Romantic movement taught people to see mountains as sublime rather than merely dangerous, to appreciate wilderness rather than only cultivated landscapes. Japanese aesthetics sensitized observers to see beauty in things like moss-covered rocks or weathered wood that earlier cultures might have overlooked. Even what we consider natural is partly shaped by human choices about what to preserve, what to call wilderness, how to frame and present natural environments. There is also the question of whether nature can truly be beautiful in the same sense as art. Art is created with intentions, expressing meanings and inviting interpretations. A painting is about something, refers to something beyond itself, embodies ideas and feelings. Does nature do any of this? Some philosophers argue that we need a different conception of aesthetic appreciation for nature, one based on scientific understanding of ecological relationships, evolutionary processes, and natural systems, rather than on the formal and expressive qualities we value in art. Another domain where beauty appears is mathematics and abstract thought. Mathematicians often speak of elegant proofs, beautiful theorems, graceful solutions to problems. This mathematical beauty seems quite different from sensory beauty. We do not see or hear abstract mathematical structures the way we see a painting or hear music. Yet, mathematicians report powerful aesthetic experiences when encountering particularly elegant mathematics, a sense of inevitability and rightness, an almost visceral satisfaction at the way pieces fit together. What makes a mathematical proof beautiful? Often it involves simplicity, using minimal assumptions to derive far-reaching conclusions. It involves clarity, making complex ideas comprehensible through the right conceptual framework. It involves surprise revealing unexpected connections between apparently unrelated domains. And it involves depth showing how surface complexity emerges from simple underlying principles. The existence of mathematical beauty raises fascinating questions. Is mathematics discovered or invented? If discovered, does the beauty we find in it say something about the fundamental structure of reality, suggesting that the universe itself has aesthetic properties? If invented, why do certain mathematical structures feel more beautiful than others? Is it because they map onto patterns our minds are built to recognize, or is there something more to it? Some philosophers have suggested that there is a deep connection between beauty, truth, and understanding. When we grasp a beautiful theory or proof, we feel we have understood something important about how things really are. The beauty is not just decoration, but a sign that we have carved nature at its joints, found genuine structure rather than arbitrary patterns. This idea goes back to ancient times, when truth and beauty were seen as intimately connected, perhaps even identical at the deepest level. Then there is moral beauty, the beauty we perceive in virtuous actions, noble character, and ethical goodness. We speak of beautiful souls, beautiful deeds, beautiful lives. What are we recognizing when we use aesthetic language in moral contexts? Some philosophers argue this is merely metaphorical, that we are extending aesthetic vocabulary to non-aesthetic domains. But others suggest there may be genuine aesthetic dimensions to moral experience. When we witness an act of extraordinary compassion or courage, we often feel something similar to aesthetic response, a sense of rightness, of something fitting and appropriate, even a kind of formal perfection in how the person responds to their situation. There can be grace in moral action, a quality that goes beyond mere correctness to something more like artistry. Moral beauty might involve harmony between a person's values, character, and actions. A unity and integrity that we recognize as beautiful even if we never use that word. This connection between moral and aesthetic value was important to many historical philosophers. Plato believed that beauty and goodness were ultimately the same at the highest level, both pointing toward the form of the good. Kant, despite carefully distinguishing aesthetic and moral judgments, thought that the beautiful served as a symbol of the morally good, preparing us to value what is right. The Romantics often saw moral and aesthetic sensitivity as developing together, both arising from a unified sensibility toward value. In contemporary philosophy, some thinkers have argued that ethics itself has aesthetic dimensions, that moral wisdom involves perceptual sensitivity to particulars rather than just application of universal rules, that moral understanding requires something like taste or judgment that cannot be fully captured in principles. Just as an art critic must learn to see what is aesthetically relevant in a work, a morally mature person must learn to see what is ethically salient in situations, and this kind of perception may have aesthetic features. Finally, there is the aesthetic dimension of everyday life, what has been called everyday aesthetics. This is beauty found not in museums or concert halls, but in ordinary experience, in the way morning light falls through a window, in the taste and presentation of a good meal, in the feel of well-designed tools, in the rhythm of daily routines. Some philosophers argue that we have paid too much attention to high art, and not enough to these everyday aesthetic experiences that actually fill most of our lives. Taking everyday aesthetics seriously changes how we think about the value and function of beauty. It is not something rare and special, encountered only on special occasions, but something potentially present in every moment if we learn to attend properly. It also raises questions about the ethics of aesthetics. If we are surrounded by human-made environments and objects, do we have responsibilities to make them beautiful? Does the ugliness of much contemporary built environment have moral implications? Can aesthetic sensitivity make us better people by teaching us to pay attention, to care about details, to value quality over mere utility? The 20th century turn. Beauty in decline and return. As we move into more recent times, we encounter a surprising development. The decline of beauty as a central concern in both philosophy and art. For much of the 20th century, beauty seemed to fall out of favor, replaced by other values and concerns. This shift is puzzling when we consider how central beauty had been to aesthetic philosophy for thousands of years. Understanding why this happened, and what has changed more recently, gives us insight into evolving attitudes toward aesthetic value and the role of art in human life. In early 20th century philosophy, beauty fell victim to broader trends in philosophical thought. The rise of logical positivism and analytical philosophy brought with it a skepticism toward value judgments of all kinds. As we discussed earlier, emotivism treated aesthetic judgments as mere expressions of feeling with no cognitive content. This made beauty seem philosophically uninteresting, a subjective preference that could not be analyzed or debated in any rigorous way. Philosophers increasingly focused on questions about the definition of art, the nature of representation, the logic of critical interpretation, and other issues that seemed more amenable to analytical methods. Beauty, if it was discussed at all, was treated as just one aesthetic property among others, and often not the most important one. In the art world itself, beauty began to be seen as old-fashioned, even suspect. Modernist movements like Cubism, Expressionism, and Dada deliberately rejected traditional notions of beauty, creating works that challenged viewers, disrupted expectations, and sometimes deliberately courted ugliness. Artists felt that beauty had become too closely associated with mere decoration, with pleasing surfaces that distracted from deeper meanings and failed to engage with the harsh realities of modern life. After the horrors of World War I, many artists felt that creating conventionally beautiful art would be a kind of lie, a refusal to acknowledge the violence and absurdity of modern existence. The avant-garde movements valued the shock, provocation, conceptual innovation, and political critique over beauty. Art was supposed to make you think, to challenge your assumptions, to raise political consciousness, not merely to provide aesthetic pleasure. Beauty came to be seen as conservative, as supporting existing power structures through the creation of objects that sedated rather than awakened critical consciousness. Some feminist critics argued that the emphasis on beauty, especially beauty of the female body, objectified women and reinforced patriarchal values. This rejection of beauty reached an extreme in some conceptual art of the late 20th century, where the idea behind a work was considered more important than any perceptual or aesthetic qualities it might have. An artwork might consist of written instructions or documentation of an action, or an ordinary object declared to be art through institutional context, with no attempt to create something visually or sensually appealing. The question was not, is this beautiful, but is this art, and what does it mean? However, beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, beauty began to make a comeback in philosophical aesthetics and, more gradually, in the art world. Several factors contributed to this revival. Some philosophers argued that the 20th century abandonment of beauty had been a mistake, a loss of something valuable from the tradition. They pointed out that beauty never really disappeared from people's actual experience of art and nature, even if philosophers and art theorists were ignoring it. People still visited museums hoping to see beautiful things, still decorated their homes with objects chosen for aesthetic appeal, still sought out beautiful natural environments. Ignoring beauty meant losing touch with an important aspect of human experience. Feminist philosophers, while continuing to critique problematic associations between beauty and women's oppression, also began to reclaim beauty as a positive value. They argued that the problem was not beauty itself, but particular narrow conceptions of beauty that served oppressive ends. Instead of abandoning beauty, we should expand and diversify our understanding of what counts as beautiful, recognizing beauty in a wider range of bodies, objects, and experiences. Beauty could be a source of empowerment and joy rather than merely a tool of objectification. Other philosophers noted that beauty had never really been abandoned outside the Western philosophical tradition. Non-Western cultures continued to value beauty highly, and ignoring this represented a kind of cultural parochialism. Cross-cultural engagement requires taking seriously how other traditions understand and value beauty, even if this challenges assumptions dominant in 20th century Western philosophy. There was also renewed interest in the phenomenology of aesthetic experience, the question of what it is actually like to encounter beauty and why it matters to us. Philosophers argued that aesthetic experience has distinctive value that cannot be reduced to political critique or conceptual innovation. Beauty addresses human needs for meaning, connection, and transcendence that are just as important as needs for understanding and social transformation. We need not choose between beauty and truth, between aesthetic and ethical value, but can recognize that human flourishing requires attention as to multiple dimensions of experience. In contemporary philosophy, beauty is once again treated as a legitimate and important topic. Philosophers debate its nature and value, its relationship to other aesthetic qualities, its role in different art forms and different cultural contexts. While few would want to return to the idea that beauty is the only aesthetic value, or that all art must strive for it, there is recognition that beauty remains central to aesthetic experience and deserves sustained philosophical attention. In the art world, the situation is more complex. Much contemporary art still values conceptual innovation and critical engagement over beauty. But there has also been a revival of interest in craft, in sensuous materiality, in creating objects that reward sustained perceptual attention. Some artists deliberately reclaim beauty as a value, arguing that making beautiful things is not escapist or conservative, but a form of resistance against the ugliness and disposability of contemporary consumer culture. Beautiful objects invite us to slow down, to pay attention, to care about quality and permanence in a world that encourages rapid consumption and disposal. The experience of beauty. What happens when we encounter it? As our exploration draws toward its close, let us return to the phenomenon itself, to the actual experience of encountering beauty and what it does to us. Beyond all the theoretical debates and philosophical frameworks, there remains the simple, powerful fact of aesthetic experience. Those moments when something beautiful stops us in our tracks, captures our attention, and produces a response that seems to go beyond ordinary perception and pleasure. What characterizes these moments? Often they involve a kind of perceptual absorption, a state where our attention becomes fully focused on the object before us. The usual chatter of the mind quiets. Practical concerns fade into the background. We are simply present to what we are experiencing, attending to its qualities with unusual intensity and clarity. Time seems to slow or stop. We become, briefly, what Schopenhauer called a will-less subject of knowing, liberated from the constant press of desires and worries that normally occupy consciousness. This absorption is not passive, however. Aesthetic experience involves active engagement, a kind of exploration where we follow the contours of what we perceive, tracing relationships among parts, discovering patterns and meanings. With a complex work of art, this can continue for a long time, as we notice new details, see new connections, understand the work in deeper ways. Even with simpler, beautiful objects, there is often a sense of inexhaustibility, a feeling that we could look forever and continue finding something to engage us. Aesthetic experience typically involves pleasure, but not the simple pleasure of satisfying a desire or fulfilling a need. It is, as Kant argued, a disinterested pleasure, one that does not depend on possessing or using the object. We can find a landscape beautiful without wanting to own it, find a piece of music beautiful without wanting to capture or control it. Indeed, part of what makes aesthetic experience precious is precisely this quality of letting things be themselves, appreciating them for what they are rather than for what they can do for us. Yet, aesthetic experience is often accompanied by powerful emotions. Beauty can move us to tears, give us chills, create feelings of joy or melancholy or longing. These emotions seem to be part of the experience itself, not merely responses to it. When we are moved by a piece of music, the emotion does not come after we have judged it beautiful, but is woven into the experience of listening. The music sounds sad or triumphant or mysterious, and these expressive qualities are part of what we perceive, not interpretations we add to neutral sensory data. There is often a sense of rightness or fittingness in aesthetic experience, a feeling the things are as they should be, that the parts come together into a harmonious whole. Even when beauty takes forms that would traditionally be called ugly, the terrible beauty of a violent storm, the austere beauty of a wilderness landscape, the dark beauty of tragic art, there is still this sense of appropriateness, of inevitability, as though what we are experiencing could not be otherwise. Aesthetic experience can also involve a sense of meaning or significance that is difficult to put into words. We feel that what we are experiencing matters, that it is telling us something important, even if we cannot quite say what. This is especially true of profound aesthetic experiences that seem to disclose new dimensions of reality or new possibilities of consciousness. In such moments, beauty seems to point beyond itself toward truths that exceed our ordinary understanding. Many people report that encounters with beauty can be transformative. A single experience of profound beauty, hearing a particular piece of music at the right moment, encountering a work of art that speaks directly to your condition, witnessing a natural phenomenon that takes your breath away, can change how you see the world and your place in it. These are not mere pleasant memories, but formative experiences that reshape identity and values. Why does beauty have this power? Perhaps because in aesthetic experience, we encounter a different mode of relating to reality than our usual pragmatic, instrumental stance. We are not trying to use or understand or change what we perceive, but simply to be present to it, to let it be itself while we remain fully attentive. This creates a space where meaning can emerge that is not imposed by our conceptual frameworks or practical purposes, where we can encounter otherness without immediately trying to assimilate it to the familiar. Beauty also seems to satisfy deep human needs that are not addressed by purely practical or intellectual activities. We need not just to survive and understand, but to feel connected, to experience meaning and value, to sense that life is worth living beyond its instrumental functions. Aesthetic experience provides this, offering moments where existence itself seems justified, where we feel the rightness of being here now, alive and conscious in a world that contains such wonders. This is why beauty has been again placed alongside truth and goodness as one of the highest values. It is not a luxury or decoration, but something essential to human flourishing. Cultures that lose connection with beauty, that create environments devoid of aesthetic value, that treat aesthetic concerns as trivial or dispensable, impoverish human life in ways that may not be immediately obvious, but are nonetheless profound. We need beauty the way we need love and knowledge and justice, as part of what makes life fully human. The philosopher Elaine Scarry, in her book On Beauty and Being Just, argues that beauty prepares us for justice, that attending to beauty cultivates capacities we need for ethical life. When we encounter beauty, we learn to attend carefully to particulars, to be present to what is before us rather than imposing our own agendas. We learn to acknowledge the value of things beyond their utility to us, to respect otherness and difference. We experience the possibility of delight in existence itself, which can make us more generous and less fearful. These same capacities are needed for justice, attention to particular others, respect for their independent value, generosity rather than grasping. This suggests that aesthetic education is not merely about learning to appreciate art or developing refined taste, but about cultivating fundamental human capacities. When we teach people to pay attention to beauty, to slow down and notice what is around them, to care about quality and excellence, we are not just making them better museum visitors, but better human beings, more capable of the kinds of perception and care that sustain human communities and human flourishing. Closing reflections. The enduring mystery. As our journey through the philosophy of beauty draws to a close, and as you drift closer to the edge of sleep, let us gather the threads we have explored and reflect on where we find ourselves. We began with a simple question. What is beauty? We have traveled through thousands of years of philosophical thought, from Plato's eternal forms to contemporary debates about objectivity and subjectivity. We have encountered grand theories and subtle arguments, moments of clarity, and regions of profound mystery. And where have we arrived? Perhaps the most honest answer is that beauty remains mysterious, that despite all the brilliant minds that have grappled with it, we still cannot fully explain what beauty is, why it moves us, or what it means. This is not a failure of philosophy, but a recognition of the genuine depth and complexity of the phenomenon. Beauty touches on fundamental questions about the nature of reality, perception, value, and human consciousness. It sits at the intersection of the objective and subjective, the universal and particular, the sensory and conceptual. No simple formula can capture it. Yet our exploration has not been in vain. We have learned that beauty is multifaceted, that it appears in many forms and contexts, from the harmonious proportions of classical art to the imperfect transience of wabi-sabi, from sublime natural landscapes to elegant mathematical proofs, from sensory pleasure to moral inspiration. We have seen that beauty can be both deeply personal and potentially universal, that our individual responses are shaped by culture and experience while also drawing on capacities and sensibilities that may be common to human nature itself. We have learned that thinking about beauty requires holding together apparent contradictions. Beauty is subjective, yet claims universality. It is immediate, yet can be educated. It is autonomous, yet connected to truth and goodness. It is present in art, but also in nature, mathematics, and moral life. Perhaps beauty resists simple definition precisely because it is a point of contact between different dimensions of experience, a place where the sensory and intellectual, individual and communal, natural and cultural meet and interact. Most importantly, we have been reminded that beauty matters. It is not a superficial concern, but something that addresses deep human needs for meaning, connection, and transcendence. In a world often characterized by ugliness, violence, and injustice, beauty offers moments of respite and renewal, glimpses of how things might be, reminders of what is worth preserving and pursuing. To cultivate sensitivity to beauty is to cultivate a more fully human way of being in the world, one that is open, attentive, and capable of wonder. The questions we have explored tonight will continue to be debated by philosophers, artists, and anyone who cares about beauty and its place in human life. New perspectives will emerge. New frameworks will be proposed. New arguments will be made. But the fundamental experience of encountering beauty, of being moved and transformed by it, will remain as long as there are conscious beings capable of aesthetic experience. So, as you continue on in your own life, encountering beauty in its many forms, I invite you to bring some of what we have explored tonight into those encounters. Notice the complexity of your responses. Attend to how beauty appears in different contexts and cultures. Reflect on what beauty means to you, what role it plays in your life, why it matters. And, perhaps most importantly, simply allow yourself to experience beauty when it appears, to be present to those moments without trying to analyze or capture them, to let beauty do whatever it does to consciousness when we are truly open to it. Before we part, if this exploration has enriched your evening, if these ideas have given you something to carry forward, I hope you will take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps others discover these quiet contemplations, ensures that more curious minds can find their way to these peaceful explorations of ideas that have shaped human understanding. Leave a comment sharing what beauty means to you, what experiences have moved you most deeply, or what questions about aesthetics intrigue you most. These conversations extend our community of inquiry, connecting thoughtful people across distances and differences. But for now, let these thoughts settle into the background. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Allow your body to relax completely, releasing any remaining tension. The night is here to hold you, to carry you gently into rest. You have spent this time thinking about beauty, but now it is time to release even these beautiful thoughts, to let go of all effort and simply be. The questions we explored tonight will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and always. They have waited for thousands of years, and will wait a little longer. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you will dream of beautiful things, or perhaps you will dream of nothing at all. Either way, you can rest knowing that you have spent this time well, exploring questions that matter, contemplating mysteries that make human life richer and more meaningful. Beauty surrounds you, even in the darkness, even in silence. It is there in the gentleness of your breathing, in the comfort of your rest, in the simple fact of consciousness itself, capable of wonder and appreciation. Let go now. Let everything soften. Let your mind drift into the formless space before sleep, where thoughts dissolve and rest begins. You are held. You are safe. You have earned this peace. Good night.